again, everyone. Um, I just wanted to thank Marjorie because the first issue that I organized with Tony Pereira, she was a key contact with the journal, and that was some of my first work with the journal. Was the first work with the journal, as I believe, as I recall, in the '90s, early '90s, and she was great. And Tim, who also has been very important to me, his study of his doctoral thesis on organized labor in Brazil was really cutting edge at the time that I was getting into labor history. So it's really great to be here with them. And yeah, and of course, none of this would be here if it wasn't for Ron, and including getting a lot of light from the street here, including the fellowship that I'm on now, and I want to thank Rosalind in particular because she was really nagging me to apply and do it and get involved, and I was having a difficult time thinking about how I would pull it off. But now it's almost over, and it's been a great experience, and I'm really grateful to her for her encouragement, and grateful to Ron and Rhonda, who's here, who helped a lot as she had helped other fellows in the past. Now retired, she was quickly responded to my emails and gave me a lot of guidance in writing the project and pulling the fellowship together, and with the move to here as well. So I'm very grateful to all of you in that sense. And I don't think anybody's here in particular from the University of Alfonso, and their support too has been good for the talk that I gave there the other day, at least. And it was nice to meet him on Thursday and hear more about the center and their work today. And yeah, there's just a lot of good people around special collections, Jessica in the library, Erica, Karen, that have been very, very helpful to me. Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not quite up on the idea of the talk in relation to political education. I have some slides, but it looks like I needed to send those to Alex in order to show them. I'm not sure. But I can talk about it in some other ways and get to the points. It was nice to hear George commenting on my talk the other day and commenting after the talk there too. So what I've been working on for almost 10 years is with just a couple of small publications, is a project about in the nature of what I call parallel history or shared history. Although I'm not too comfortable with the shared idea, but anyway, about agrarian reform in two places, and the one being California and the other one Brazil. I think for me, studying agrarian reform in Brazil has been almost normal. It's a big part of the history of Latin America. And what surprised me when I was told about the archive for the organization called National Land for People, which when I was a student at Santa Cruz, I didn't know about it. And George remembers it from those days, but was active in the '70s, and in the Central Valley, the main leader is a guy named George Ballas, and his wife Maya too. Those two, Mary Louise Frampton, their lawyer, and quite a few other people involved. And it's kind of it's sometimes called a lobby, sometimes called a movement, sometimes non-governmental organization, which it was a nonprofit. That's how they registered themselves in the early 70s. And what was it all about? It was an organization that was carrying on a struggle that had been sort of really picked up by an economist at Berkeley named Paul Taylor in the 1940s and carried into the 50s and the 60s. Taylor died in the early 80s and inspired George, who was a labor journalist in Fresno, about this question. And the question was the Reclamation Act of 1902, the U.S. Reclamation Act of 1902, which included in it two key stipulations. One is referred to as the acreage limitation, and the other one as excess lands, the necessity of selling off lands that were in excess of the amount you could have. So according to this law, which was defended in court, reaffirmed in Congress many times, and challenged many times, and always reaffirmed in the sense that water from federal irrigation projects, and the Central Valley is a place where the largest irrigation project in the world has been built. There are more than 20 reservoirs and dams in the Central Valley that feed it water, and that water is also transferred to Southern California for people to drink and use to wash with and so forth. It said, according to this law, you could not have more than 160 acres to receive the water. And the water is crucial for Central Valley agriculture. There was a slight reform in the early years after 1902. I think it was around I should have looked it up again, but 1916 or 1920, around there, that enabled a husband and wife, a very traditional kind of family notion, to have 320 acres. So the husband and wife would each be allowed 160 acres. So the farm could have legally receive water with 320 acres. But already in the late 19th century, and certainly in the 20th century, there were huge farms in the Central Valley, tens of thousands of acres, and Southern Pacific Railroad, a huge amount of land that they held. Russell Giffen is one of the villains of the story. He was a big cotton farmer, the Cotton King, and he had over 20,000 acres. Boswell is another big name. And I've been focusing, it's a big area, so I've been focusing on what's known as the Westlands Water District and the NLP. So those are my kind of the good guys and the bad guys, let's say, or what George would say, he said the biggies. So in the context of the Cold War, he avoided using class-related language, but that's basically what he's talking about. So the big farmers were certainly, the rural bourgeoisie, and he was going to go to battle with them first as a muckraking journalist, and then as and photojournalist, working with farm workers a lot too, with the farm workers movement during the 60s. And then in the early 70s, forming this organization, National Land for People, which was a platform for trying to establish what he called a spiral strategy of trying to get the law implemented the way it was supposed to be and should be. So the biggies were working hard to try to escape the law, retain their lands, not have to abide by the law. And the great target of both of them for trying to influence it, like if you had a little triangle, you'd see NLP battling the Westlands Water District, and the Westlands Water District battling the NLP. But both of them were after, up here, the United States Bureau of Reclamation, who was responsible for these projects and responsible for implementing the law, for forcing the sale of lands beyond the 320 limit, because they couldn't receive water. If you didn't want water, if you wanted, if you could get groundwater, that was okay, but you couldn't have access to this federal water. So it's all, but it's complicated to manage, complicated to watch out for, making sure that that happens. And what one of the aspects of the strategy of George that they developed early on, before the National Land for People existed, were maps that showed the sections, 160-acre sections of the Central Valley, and they colored them in. They did a lot of research in the titles and discovered the relationships between different so-called title owners who are buying these excess lands supposedly, and the original owner. So it was all sort of a covering up who owned and controlled the large land by saying that they were sold to friends and family and employees. And so by coloring in these sections on the map, you could see that all that red color was Russell Giffin's land, really, even though it was supposedly in the names of all kinds of other people. And there was a lot of then ways of, as we say in Brazil, burlando a lei, getting around the law. And so he went to Congress. They lobbied around this a lot. They built up alliances with a lot of other organizations. These are years that that the government is leaning more and more into modernization. The Green Revolution in the United States, the Nixon administration, Earl Butz saying, if you're not big, you get out. Get out of farming. You got to be big. We got to produce lots of stuff. And so the concept of agrarian reform, because this really wasn't agrarian reform, not only was the land to be limited, which could receive water, but also the farmers had to be resident on the farm, or they could live within 50 miles. So the idea was really, and people got approval of the dam and reservoir construction and canal construction projects, saying that once these are implanted, there'll be tens of thousands of small communities and small farms in the Central Valley. So they used the law to convince other lawmakers to give them the money to build these dams and build these reservoirs, with this concept of the small farmer, Jeffersonian traditions, democracy, and so forth. And at the same time, of course, the United States was supporting what was called agrarian reform in foreign policy, particularly in Latin America, from the Alliance for Progress, demanding that the countries of Latin America that participated have agrarian reform laws. But when you look at it, it looks like a contradiction. The U.S. is suppressing agrarian reform. The government is suppressing agrarian reform in the United States and imposing it in Latin America. But what you really see is in both countries, in different ways, they're working on the theory that production is what matters more than anything else, production and accumulation of capital. And so in Latin America, the agrarian reform laws are undermined as well. Sometimes they're built around the idea of market-based agrarian reform, production-based agrarian reform, profit-based agrarian reform. And so there's really an interesting alignment there with different language. And what basically comes to pass is that the NLP succeeds through court battles principally, but not, yeah, so they focus a lot on court battles. They do a lot of lobbying in Congress. They're trying to hold the line around that 160 or 320 acre limit, and get the cases, the legal cases, out of Fresno County, where the power structure is such that they can't make it much headway there, and get it into federal court. And when they get it into federal court, the people look at the law. Even Supreme Court decisions have been decided around this question, and they say the Westlands Water District needs to sell off their extra land, their excess lands. And so in the Carter administration, there's some sympathy with Cecil Andrus as Secretary of the Interior, and they begin to write the rules, and they actually produce the rules, consulting with the NLP for how these excess lands have to be sold in a fair way. And the basic political game that the NLP played, or strategy, I think I should say, was that they got farm workers and other interested parties to sue sue the Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency, so it could be elevated to the federal courts and moved to Washington. The case moved to Washington, suing the Bureau of Reclamation for not imposing the law, for not implementing the law, and that they needed to have rules that were transparent about how the process should occur. And like I said, they succeed. The Bureau does not appeal under the Carter administration. They actually write the rules, but there's several other little stages that they have to go through. And what happens? Carter loses the election. Reagan wins the election, and we can document that Reagan is totally in the pocket of the biggies, large agribusiness, and actually, as governor, he tried to undermine the Reclamation Act, but not being in the federal government, he couldn't really do it. He just contributed to that undermining that was already going on. And then now, as president, he's already with a whole plan of reform of the reclamation law, and Congress is sympathetic, and when George Bayless goes to give testimony one day, the Republicans say, have you submitted written remarks? And he says, yes, I've submitted written remarks. Well, then we'll just publish them. Thank you very much, and send him away. And it's sort of very crushing to him, because he'd always been sought out to be heard about this issue. And they reformed the Reclamation Act in 1982, eventually, not slowly, but moving it I'll just simplify the story a little bit, moving it to 960 acres, which is way beyond something that a family can maintain. So and then there was even a further reform that permits a single manager to manage many sections of 960 acres. So it's possible with financial capital to come in and create huge farms that don't violate the law and can receive the federal water, which is basically how things are today. And so I've found in my study of the Central Valley that the archives at the University of California, Riverside have been very useful. There's a collection that was started at Berkeley and passed. They didn't want to maintain it any longer, and it's been passed to the University of California at Riverside. It's called the Water Resources Collection and Archive, WRCA. And this Water Resources Collection and Archive is very rich with the papers of many people involved, principally in the Central Valley Project issues. And one of the most useful collections was by a guy named Ralph M. Brody that I found in the collection. He was the lawyer for the Westlands Water District. And in there you can see them strategizing as to how to cover up. You can see something that they didn't reveal to the public was that they were really bothered by the National Land for People, and there were files and files and files about, excuse me, I'm using Portuguese now and then, about acreage limitation and excess land sales, and they put together charts to show how that had been sold. So they would have the opposite kind of maps from the ones that Bayless was producing. They put all different colors on it, right? And working on the concept of the family farmer, to try to say that a guy like Russell Giffen was a family farmer with this, this huge corporate farm that he had. That corporate farms are family farms, and how could they defend that? Trying to develop a discourse about that. Um, so that's been very useful. There's also some U.S. Bureau of Reclamation files there, which I looked at. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what research I might find or what I've found there. So I've been to the archives of the United States Bureau of Reclamation in Denver, in near San Francisco and San Bruno. There's also a collection, an important collection for the state of for the Western District, which is all the Western the Pacific states. So that I didn't find too much that was interesting in that particular set of documents. And then I think probably most important for all of us is Ron's papers, and those were the first ones I looked at for a couple of weeks, and I was just with using the cam scanner. I don't know if you know this this app or program. You take pictures with your phone, and so I've got files with 1,000 documents photographed, or 500 here, 600 there, 800 there, 1,300. And in order to process them as PDFs, you have to sort of do a little cropping on them to make them useful. If you just leave the picture there, it's a little too confusing, and it does its own cropping too. So you need to look at every single image. Some of them are easy because it's like a legal document, and it's a nice clean page one after the other. But others are very, very confusing with the different colors and how it interprets that. So you have to look at it again and recrop it. And so I was going through Chilcote's again, and what he did, Ron's files there are, it's an extensive collection, and of course he knows it better than anybody else. But he basically, if you were to look at his books, you'll find that his files are very related to his different books. And if as you read his different books, you realize that he's got somehow or other, he has stuff from interviews in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and sometimes the 90s. So all of that's in there. And so you've got this historical perspective of his research experience. What was most interesting to me was his research in the Northeast. Clippings, interviews, notes, documents. And so he was interested in the agrarian reform question, and peasant movements, and in elite reactions and responses to those movements. So there's lots of stuff that's helping enrich my research about Brazil as well. I'm a specialist in the state of Sao Paulo's history, and particularly its rural history. But this has enabled me to really see what was going on in the Northeast. And I was already a part of the project. As a matter of fact, I was thinking about this because the Northeast is a better comparative model than Sao Paulo because of the dry conditions. Knowing Brazil a bit, the Northeast is kind of famously plagued with droughts, and sort of like the Central Valley is. And so the semi-arid conditions are a little more comparable. And the Bureau of Reclamation has even been active in the Brazilian Northeast, which is not really a big surprise, but it's very useful to tell the story. With some of the same ideas about land being limited to family farmers, some of the same kinds of arguments that were used there. But the Brazilian influence is much more important, and they sort of quickly dismiss all of that as no more than window dressing, and get down to business about getting huge public works projects built, particularly during the dictatorship, which is perfect for that idea of parallel histories. Which is a research that I need to spend more time on. I was sort of a real neophyte about California's agricultural history, but since about 2007, I've been trying to get smarter about it and learn more about it. And I've been making some advances, to say the least. But at any rate, yeah, Chilcote's records have been very useful for peasant movements, agrarian reform, Northeastern politics, and lots of clippings from the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, which is just perfect for following along what was happening in Brazil during the same context. Well, that, I tried to summarize what I'd worked on, and actually said more than I thought I would. So I thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'm pleased to answer them. Hi, Fran.
Well, it's interesting, your observations about the data. There is a lot of data in there. There was all the I was interested in the shift of commercial capitalism into large scale capitalism in Sertão of Brazil. Some might say, the small poor farmers and how they were tied into the Northeast, how they were servants of the coronels who dominated the Northeast, and in that area, it was family control, but shift transition from commercial life to large scale capitalism was the goal of those ruling families. We have an editor, I don't know if you know her, Monica Martins.
No.
Who lives in Fortaleza. Monica's an interesting person. She started as a student at the beginning of the dictatorship in Rio, demonstrating in Praça 15. And this demonstration was raided by the military and ended up, many of her classmates and friends were killed in the process. She fled to the Northeast. She just left town and never came back, really, leaving her family behind. She'd come back, but for years and years in the dictatorship, she began to organize in the Northeast. She married another progressive person, and they began to take vacant land and bring peasants together and legitimize and legalize their work on a piece of agricultural land. When I set up the UC, University of California program in Brazil, which I mentioned to you the other day, we went to the Northeast. We went first to the Amazon, but we ended up for cultural work in the Northeast, in Fortaleza. Monica Martins was living some of the time in Fortaleza, but she was working in the countryside and organizing communities. And the first thing that we did with the students, because she was very involved with the students, she would take the students into these communities who had occupied land that was inactive and just took it over and legitimized it. That's an interesting story. We don't have much on that in the archive. The other thing that I was interested in, I think I mentioned to you the other day, was all these movements of resistance against oligarchs and coronéis and people who are dominating the land in the Northeast. Ralph Della Cava did a study of Padre Cicero. You probably know, but that was further north in the Northeast. And there was Lampião and all these other really interesting people who appear in the Cordell literature. I don't know if you paid any attention to the Cordell literature or if you know about it. Kemi from Chile actually um, came to Riverside as an LAP fellow to study the Cordell, the Brazilian Cordell. She knows about it in Chile. And this is from a medieval tradition, but active in Latin America in the 19th and 20th century. But the Cordell literature, 5,000 pamphlets in my collection. They range from 16 to 32, 64, and sometimes more pages. And it's recording of sometimes spontaneous singing. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but these are examples of the underclasses resisting the dominance from above and having their own struggles. And that was the part of the story I didn't really get to tell in the book.
Yeah, the Literatura do Cordel is very, very interesting, very rich. Yeah, and it's great to have that collection available in your collection.
Yeah.
But I did, yeah, we didn't mention Monica Martinez the other day, so I'm gonna try to look her up then. Yeah. And Sierra is I've made several trips there and have some colleagues in the history department at the Federal University, and I've done some field trips with them. So I'm thinking about either there or the Valley of the San Francisco as sort of settings.
So that's where I was.
Yeah. And so either you have a lot of good stuff there from that.
And our two boys when they were very young.
Cool.
Yeah, Cliff had a question. It seems that the water struggle in California was very much legally oriented and through taking on the landowners through the courts. Whereas in Brazil, I think of the MST and the land movements as more of on the ground occupying territory. I'm just wondering, was there a comparable, besides the legal strategy in California, was there a mass, something like you would later see with the United Farm Workers, where there were mass organizations making waves in public, or was it mostly done through the court challenges?
Well, it was mostly done through the courts. It was mostly done through the courts, but George and in terms of national land for people, they were very busy looking for farm workers interested in becoming farmers. Okay, there was one former farm worker co-op that they helped support and worked with and were members of the board, like Jessie de la Cruz. You might have heard of her. She was an important ally to the NLP. So and she had been a leader of the UFWA, and in addition to that, they did build up a co-op in terms of buying and selling co-op. They put out a lot of literature in the idea of mobilizing among students and small farmers in the valley. And they also connected up with a lot of other small farmer alliances around the West, because it's important to say that the Reclamation Act was not only effective in the central and being overlooked in the Central Valley, but in all of the 17 Western states. That's what the reclamation was about, to reclaim, even the concept of it is very interesting, but the idea of reclaiming the land for progress, basically, in a capitalist sense. So in some states where reservoirs were built, there were actually agrarian reform settlements constructed, as there were in Washington state. So there were different people in different places that were connected to this movement. The National Farmers Union was sympathetic and working with George, for example, as another lobby in Washington. So, but you don't find occupations occurring in response to this, but you find people suing to get the right to access the excess land. So yeah, it's definitely different in that sense. And that's going to be interesting to explore even more.
You know, how many of those suits were successful with the owners subdividing their land, all their friends and relatives? How much land actually got transferred to legitimate, you know, farm workers or aspiring small farmers?
Mhm. Yeah, in the Central Valley, from what I know, but it's a good question, and trying to quantify that will be challenging. That's what I've decided to limit the study in some kinds of ways, because I'm not going to have the capacity to do a study on the for the whole Central Valley. So that's why I'm looking at the NLP and the Westlands Water District, which is the largest water district in the country. So I think in that context I could probably calculate it, but basically they managed to get around the law. So there was only a few successes in terms of real sales of excess lands and given to family farmers and stuff like that. As far as I can tell from the clippings, the newsletters, and everything that I've read, there was hardly any. And then it becomes a question of undercutting, the law being totally undercut by the Reform Act that enabled people to have these huge estates.
Was there any awareness, mutual awareness of like of the movements in California, of what was going on in Brazil or other places in Latin America? Was there any sense of that this was all part of a broader?
Yeah, the one research that I've concluded and published, but only in Portuguese, is about the farm worker organizing in California and in Brazil. And the UFWA sent some of its leaders to Brazil to see how the rural labor movement was organized there. So there's that exchange that I know about. And another one that I think is really important, but it's a little less direct, is that the NLP was really up to date about the leftist interpretation of what was happening in Brazil in terms of the agrarian reform. So they have a whole lot of the literature from the era that was produced, talking about from Brazil, from Nicaragua, from Mexico. So they were very inspired by the struggle for agrarian reform in Latin America to make their and identified with it as part of their organizing tactics and messaging. So they were up on it. You know, NACLA during that time had a Western office. You know, what's it, Roger, I'm going to forget their names, but Patricia Flynn and Roger, you guys know him. I'm sure you know him.
Burbank. Roger Burbank.
Roger
Burbank.
Burbank, yeah. And yeah, I maybe you were friends with and stuff, but I met him and we organized an event for honoring the agribusiness in Latin America book and stuff at LASA before he died, and another one with Patricia Flynn. So I'm embarrassed that I couldn't remember the name right now. But at any rate, so the writing of that book and that story and the revelations about American agribusiness in Latin America was, you know, happening simultaneously with the NLP and its struggle. So there's a lot of very interesting overlaps there, particularly in the state of California, connected to Latin America. Also, I'm looking at some of the same companies, like one in particular that I've been pursuing information on is Anderson Clayton Company, a big peanut producer for one thing, peanut oil. And they actually had farmers on the agrarian reform settlements that were built in the 60s, and some of them continue to today in Sao Paulo, producing peanuts for their company. And I recall when I first went to Brazil in 1986, buying Anderson Clayton peanut butter, because it's hard to find in Brazil. It's not normally in the market, but that one brand was that's since defunct. But I'm trying to find the corporate papers for that organization, but I'm coming across its presence in the NLP papers and other papers that I come upon. So they were also in the Central Valley. And the farm workers are another, I already mentioned that, but because George was a photojournalist, he helped promote the farm worker movement a lot and was pretty close to Cesar Chavez. And George comments that Cesar said, well, I hope you're not successful, because if all of my members become small farmers, I won't have a union anymore. So that was part of his reaction to George's struggle.
Yeah, well, that makes me think of, the strategy of the Alliance for Progress in Chile under Frey, which was to create a bunch of small farmers as a way of undercutting peasant movements for, broader kinds of land reform.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. Well, certainly that was part of the strategy of using the term agrarian reform in Brazil too, as a way of trying to alter the dynamic, and get people engaged. Until today, really, the market-based agrarian reform strategy is one of trying to undercut the popular, what in fact the MST calls the popular agrarian reform, which is determined by the people, how it's going to be implanted and what it's going to look like.
Joanna Salem, who is not with us now, but earlier was, is in Sao Paulo, and I think
Thanks, Rhonda. Pardon me?
You know Joanna.
Yes.
And she has put together work on Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire was very involved in the communities that I studied in the Northeast. He actually went into those communities and organized peasants, got a literacy program moving forward, and so forth. And he went elsewhere around the world, and it was his method of teaching illiterates was quite well received around in the third world areas. But did you and we're actually Tim Harding and Fran and Marjorie and Don Bray and I had years ago, we spent a day with Paulo Freire and Cesar Chavez up in his headquarters in Southern California. And that was amazing. But I'm wondering if any of Paulo Freire's work creeps into your interest in study of the Northeast and rural areas and organization.
Well, it's interesting to find Paulo Freire's work in the NLP archive. So they were certainly influenced by Paulo Freire and the popular education techniques that he used. They tried to apply. So that's you can see the influence. Just a few weeks before Cesar Chavez died, I invited him to Grand Valley State University, and he spent a week with him. I had no idea, he was there in March and died in April, so it was pretty amazing. to have that opportunity I got to spend several days with him.
Is that stuff recorded or is that I mean, today people record everything, you know, so there's like visuals, audio records of everything. Do you have any stuff, recordings or anything of those?
Well, I mean, I have some things about his presence there, but no, yeah, of course, I had no idea he was going to die, and it wasn't really the moment of social media where you record
no.
everything and stuff. So no, nothing, just a few photos and stuff like that. And as a child of the ILWU in San Francisco, we also, the union gave a lot of support to the farm workers movement, and so as a kid I was pretty exposed to that support. Well, I appreciate your questions and your attention, and the grant for sure, the fellowship.
Thank you so much. I think, I don't know what happened to Alex. I'm not sure Alex is still here, but thank you so much for your being with us. And you are the 12th
Right, yeah.
of the
The
fellowship.
dirty dozen.
Yes. Four of those 12 became editors of LAP after
Wow.
which was nice. So it's a nice way to reach out, and the funds for the fellowship were raised by, I think, about 75, 80 people. It involved Latin Americanists, and we spent 2 years getting together what turned out to be about $150,000. And I think it has accumulated to about $300,000 to keep the thing going indefinitely.
The way I had mentioned to you